the Fifth Crusade, and medieval military insurgency. This is Just Feudal Things, Episode 5. Today we're talking with Professor Laurence Marvin from Berry College, whom I will introduce in just a moment. Just Feudal Things is a conversational podcast about medieval history with subject matter experts and enthusiasts. If you'd like to follow along, the hub for the entire Memory Medieval project, the podcast, and the Medieval History Book Club is on Substack. You can find the link below. You can also follow me on X for more medieval content, and the podcast is available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. If you have a moment to leave a review at the end, or if you want to leave a comment and let me know any additional historical context, something I missed, or if you have any additional thoughts, I appreciate all of those as well. Today we're talking with Laurence Marvin, who has taught at Berry College in Northwest Georgia for the past 27 years, where he's a professor of history. He just released a book last year, The Damietta Crusade, published by Oxford University Press. You can find a link for that in the description. In addition to his books, he's written a number of articles, book chapters, encyclopedia articles for journals such as the Journal of Medieval History and the Journal of Military History. He also contributed a chapter on medieval military insurgency to the book that we discussed in the very first episode of Just Feudal Things, which was the giant compilation on medieval military strategy compiled by John D. Hostler and Daniel P. Frank. All right, so you've written a book on the Fifth Crusade called The Damietta Crusade, and that is a little bit of a lesser-known crusade, at least from my perspective. So maybe if you could, in brief, sort of summarize the Fifth Crusade for us.
So the Fifth Crusade was the first crusade that was actually carried out against Egypt rather than trying to take Jerusalem. The Fourth Crusade, originally, the idea had been Egypt as well, but it never got off the ground. Of course, eventually they took Constantinople instead. So the Fifth Crusade was preached to do what the Fourth Crusade did not, and so they decided to go through Egypt as opposed to take Jerusalem directly. So what they wanted was Jerusalem, but that's what the Muslim world knew that's what they wanted to. So the idea was, let's go through a back door and let's try to seize a city that's actually economically much more valuable than Jerusalem is, and then we can use it as a bargaining chip. So the Crusade is unique because the main theater of action, although there was a secondary and a tertiary theater as well, but the main action took place in Egypt. So that's the Fifth Crusade in a nutshell. Didn't go well in the end, but that's what it was about.
Okay, so maybe can you tell us a little bit about how it went?
Well, it didn't go well really from the start. When the armies were put together actually in the Holy Land, I mean, they'd come from a variety of different places, but once they landed in Egypt, in order to take Cairo, which is what they wanted to do, in order to, of course, as I say, use that as the bargaining chip, they had to use the Nile River. I mean, it's pretty hard to march an army overland, so it's a lot easier to supply and move an army by river. The problem was, of course, there were towns along the way, and the first large town was Damietta. And so they had to take Damietta in order to control back to the sea, and before they could move against Cairo. And there are other towns as well, but Damietta was the biggest one, the closest one to the outlet to the Mediterranean Sea. So they ended up besieging the city of Damietta, and that was a tremendous ordeal. And really, they exhausted themselves. And so after that, they did eventually take the city after a long siege. It took a long time to decide, okay, so now what do we do? And then eventually they decided again to move towards Cairo, and that's where they eventually ran into massive problems. They got down to where Mansoura is now, and they were surrounded, and the Sultan of Egypt sent ships behind them they had missed an outlet. They'd passed a what looked like an outlet on the Nile, and they the leaders thought, well, is it possible for ships to get behind us as we move down the river, or I should say up the river? And they said, no, it won't happen, but it did. So they got cut off from the Nile, and they couldn't move forward because they were sort of trapped at that V in the river where Mansoura is. And the Sultan then flooded the land behind them. And when they finally decide, okay, we better try to march back to Damietta at that point, they just couldn't do it. They literally got stuck in the mud and had to surrender. So the army ended up surrendering, and they got to go home, unlike what happened with Louis IX's crusade against the same target. But it was a humiliating defeat.
And so, how did you end up writing a book on this?
Well, so what's interesting is that the Fifth Crusade, as you say, it's a lesser known crusade, and there's only been, to my knowledge, and we'll see if something shows up that I wasn't aware of, but in the last 120 years or so, there's only been one book written on the Fifth Crusade. Now, there's been articles, and there's an edited volume, very good edited volume that came out, I think, in 2015. But as far as just writing a book about the Crusade, there was one done in 1986 by Jim Powell called An Anatomy of a Crusade, and it was about the Fifth Crusade. So some years ago, I was writing an encyclopedia article, and one of the entries was on the Fifth Crusade, and I thought I knew it. I had read Powell and liked it. And when I got down to actually writing the encyclopedia article, I realized that Powell was interested in a lot of things. He was actually less interested in how the crusade had gone. So he was very interested in the planning for it, the sort of church response to this, raising money, all that sort of thing. But the amount of time he spent on the crusade was only a small part of the book. And as I was doing this encyclopedia article, I thought, man, there must have been more to this than what he was writing. So I thought, well, perhaps it's worth looking at, especially because I am a military historian, and maybe there's some things there that just haven't been talked about. And so I wrote it from the perspective as a military campaign. So rather than as a crusade in the round, which I was less interested in, I really wanted to know, okay, how did this proceed? I already knew the ending, but how did you get to that ending? And so, and as it turns out, there was plenty to talk about. So
what were a few of the things that you sort of discovered in that deep dive from a military perspective?
Well, I think, one of the things that Powell identified, and I think he was partially right, is he said, he more or less suggested that the main reason it failed is because the leadership was poor. There were some really powerful antagonisms between the papal legate, in other words, the Pope's man on the ground, and sort of the leading noble who was the titular king of Jerusalem, John of Brienne. And it was an important discovery that Powell made, that the leadership thing really caused some problems. But as I got into it more, I realized that was just only one part of it. It's an important part, but it was only one part. One of the things I found is that because the army was so international, they simply didn't get along with each other, and so there were sort of regional and ethnic antagonisms. One of the things the Fifth Crusade had in common with the Albigensian Crusade is that people would leave right in the middle of it. Now, Powell had also talked about that too, but I think I spent more effort trying to sort of talk about that. And so, it failed for a variety of reasons. I think Frederick II, who became the Emperor of the Romans, he was supposed to eventually command it, and he kept delaying, and that made the army there delay. They kept waiting for Frederick. So there's really a whole host of reasons why it wasn't successful. It was also, one of the other things I found is I think it failed because, in fact, they could have theoretically got Jerusalem back. So in the midst of negotiations before Damietta fell, the Sultan of Egypt offered Jerusalem back if they would leave. And there was a big discussion among the leadership about whether they should take the deal. And I think we'll never really know whether the Sultan was just buying time or whether he could actually deliver on it, because actually Jerusalem more or less was administered by his brother rather than himself. And but who knows? I mean, they could have taken the deal, but by then they were so fixated on taking Damietta. It had been such a slog that they decided that, no, we're going to take Damietta, come hell or high water. And so the crusade could have theoretically ended with a negotiated diplomatic ending, and it did actually, but it's with the Crusader army having to surrender.
With the wrong negotiated deal at the end there, because I was reading up a little bit to prepare for talking to you, and I'm reading this, and it says, he offered them to give them back what they wanted, essentially.
Yes.
In parts, and I'm a little confused by that. Why, what's sort of the, I guess you kind of said, but like, why don't you take the deal?
Well, I think it comes down to a certain, and what I say, I think in the conclusion, is that Damietta became an idée fixe. I mean, in other words, these guys had spent so many months trying to get this target that they kind of lost sight of the goal. And remember that the ultimate goal was to get Jerusalem back. So whatever would get Jerusalem back. But so they lost sight of all that. What they decided is, okay, this is where we've bled ourselves out. We're going to take this city. And but there was also discussion about whether the Sultan could actually deliver on his promises. And as I said, he didn't actually control Jerusalem, his brother did. And so it is possible, I think more than possible, that he would not have been able to do what he said, or maybe not quite to the extent that he promised. So I think that it might have been a different outcome had they accepted the deal. And they surely would have got some of what they wanted. And of course, what they really wanted was the return of Jerusalem.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I find really interesting. I mentioned that in the previous episode, was that it's really interesting, and it's very easy, I think, to look back in time and think something like, well, why didn't they take the deal? Just take the deal. But at the time, like you're saying, there could be some variance with his ability to actually deliver on the deal. And so, it's not as, from our perspective now looking back, it's maybe a little more clear cut that seems like, why wouldn't you just do this? It seems pretty obvious. But when you look at those types of factors, such as actually being able to deliver on the deal, then it gives you a little bit of a different perspective into the decision-making that they had at the time.
Right. And it had been such an ordeal. I mean, the sources are very detailed on the grind of the siege. And I can understand if I were a 13th century person that at a certain point you believe that it has to mean something. And for those men on the ground, eventually they felt like the only way it's going to mean something is if we take the city. Now, as I say, unfortunately, it means they weren't thinking about, the actual goal of getting Jerusalem back. But it's perfectly understandable when you see it from their standpoint. Us looking back, of course, we can see, yeah, you made all kinds of mistakes. But when you're actually living through it, it's not near as obvious. So, if obvious at all.
Right. Yeah, that definitely seems to be a common theme in my reading, for sure.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about, so one of the things that actually, it's interesting because, as you alluded to, the struggles that they had on the Fifth Crusade also plagued Louis IX on his crusades. And interestingly, a lot of the struggles that you're talking about in the Fifth Crusade plagued earlier crusades, which I am more familiar with, such as the Third Crusade with Richard the Lionheart. And he sort of famously had a lot of infighting in his army. Obviously, the French contingent fought with him. The Genoese and the Pisans fought with each other. A bunch of other people fought with each other. They were all, nobody liked each other, I think, essentially.
Right.
And also, interestingly, there was a huge split in his army between certainly the local contingents, which included the Templars and the Hospitallers, wanted to attack Egypt. And then the main contingent of the army, as they were obviously that close to Jerusalem, wanted to attack Jerusalem, which I think is probably, I think it was basically a suicidal proposition, which I think he probably rightfully didn't siege Jerusalem. So how did this strategic objective of Egypt come about? And I guess, do you think that's a reasonable, proposition?
I do think it was reasonable, and it had first emerged during the Third Crusade. In fact, it seems to have originated with Richard. He thought about maybe what we should do is try to take Egypt. It's unclear as to if he was thinking about it purely in terms of getting Jerusalem, or hey, it's Egypt would be a valuable economic prize. But it did begin with him, and again, the Fourth Crusade. The original target was Egypt, the idea being to seize Cairo probably, or threaten it, and get Jerusalem back. So the idea had been around for a long time. Now, one of the arguments that I try to make in my book is when they decided that they would first move against Damietta. I mean, because obviously the Nile has several outlets, and Alexandria would have been a fair target as well. So what I argue, and as I say, there's still going to be some debate about this, is that they probably decided that Egypt would be the target at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, but they weren't sure where it would be in Egypt, and that had to be decided ultimately by the commanders on the ground. So I argue that they didn't actually decide to move against Damietta probably until everybody had landed. They'd been there some time, and they had a lot of discussions about what they wanted to do, and then so they eventually chose Damietta. But I think the strategy of moving against Cairo was a great one. It was perfectly realistic. It made a lot of sense because, again, Jerusalem was so well known, even among Muslims, that, this is what these guys want. And so to move against another city made perfect sense, and it could have worked. Lots of things can work or maybe work, but this could have worked had things unfolded a little bit differently. But one of the interesting things about differences between the Fifth Crusade and Louis the Ninth's Crusade is that it was the exact same ground. But Louis actually had a lot less trouble at the beginning. I mean, he took Damietta almost immediately. Right, so in other words, there wasn't a grinding siege that the Fifth Crusaders encountered. So he was able to take Damietta. He too ran into some of the issues once they marched forward, but the result was even worse for Louis IX. I mean, the Crusaders of the Fifth Crusade got out, I guess you could say, with their honor. Right, not much else, but at least with their honor. But I mean, Louis was. They threatened to break his legs. A lot of people were executed after they surrendered. So it was a terrible, terrible result. And it wasn't quite so bad on the Fifth Crusade. Humiliating for sure, but they did get out of it alive and in one piece.
And Louis met disaster almost in the same spot, right? Mansoura or somewhere.
That's right. Yeah, but I mean, in some ways, it was worse in a sense because they actually had more opportunities. So in the Fifth Crusade, they could just never cross the river there. But of course, for Louis, a local said, "Hey, there's a ford nearby, and you can cross." And they did cross. But then, of course, the troops that established a beachhead, so to speak, on the other side didn't wait and then went into the city. And that's, of course, what precipitated the disaster. Whereas the Fifth Crusade, they never got across the river. They got stuck north of Mansoura, and they couldn't get any closer. So it's interesting when you compare the events because the result was the same. The ground was the same. But again, the details were fundamentally different. I mean, another difference too is that for Louis' crusade, they had a commander, right? I mean, a commander that nobody questioned. The army was also more homogenous too. It was mostly French as opposed to the international kind of nature of the Third Crusade and also the Fifth Crusade. So often in history, things seem to be similar, but the more you get into them, the more you realize there's some pretty important differences.
Well, that unified commander, I feel like, makes a huge difference,
of course,
assuming that you listen to him.
Right. Well, and it's true they ran into those problems, but that's a problem that in the 21st century we're not immune from either, right? So, I mean, whenever you're dealing with humans, there's a possibility of other humans not doing what you tell them to do or ask them to do.
So maybe just from a general look, what should we sort of take away from the Fifth Crusade? Maybe how should we kind of look at that, in the in the progression of the Crusades, what are sort of maybe the big takeaways or the things that are important from that?
Well, I think that one of the things that surprised me is that it lasted a lot longer than it should have. I mean, these Crusaders were far from home, and in the broad scope of military history, I mean, even as late as World War II, trying to island hop or to move great distances over water, thousands of miles from home, is incredibly difficult. And so you had these armies that were far from home, and the sea was a very unfriendly place. They had to sustain themselves in this foreign theater. And one of the arguments I do make, too, is that the Crusaders had a lot more blue water experience as far as their navies go. I mean, they controlled the Mediterranean more or less, but they didn't have experience in brown water fighting, right? So in other words, Damietta was up the Nile River, and of course Mansoura was farther up even there. So they had to learn as they went, and it was kind of an amphibious crusade, more so than earlier crusades. And so that just made things difficult. You're operating around water, but it was water that has a definite border, so to speak. So I think it's amazing they held on as long as they did. It says a lot about their resilience, that despite the fact they didn't get along with each other and they had a divided command, that they could sustain this campaign for as long as they did. And of course, as they say, if some things had not happened, they might have pulled it off, right? So I think there's a number of takeaways. It also, as I argue in the book, it was kind of a snapshot. You can kind of look at this from the grand strategic level, the operational level, and of course, as say, the tactics, so the sieges and the battle that took place. And I think that's interesting. I mean, I think most people who are interested in military history, you just don't sort of see that analysis for the Middle Ages. And I think the Fifth Crusade was a perfect campaign to sort of see this from the top. In other words, this is what the Christian world wanted, the Latin Christian world. This is how they tried to do it. This is the means by which they were going to do it, and this is how they fought it.
That's one of the things that I think doesn't get enough credit for the Crusaders throughout this period, is how logistically insane, and that's my words, I feel like it is to actually pull some of these things off. You hear about, of course, people are familiar with like Alexander or Caesar, but these guys had supply lines. They sort of went as they were, as they were conquering or fighting. They had sort of a, or Napoleon, they had like a bureaucratic system behind them that could supply them in these types of things. But I don't think people, it's certainly, I feel like, is maybe underappreciated how logistically crazy it is in that time, without MREs, without the internet, without these types of things, to just go 2,000 miles away and then supply thousands or tens of thousands of men for months or years. It's quite a logistical feat, I feel like.
That's right. Until the late 19th century and railroads and canned food, armies were dependent really actually on the local area where they operated. And so the fact is, it was impossible to supply an army thousands of miles away across the sea. You could do it with certain, you could reinforce, you could bring horses. You couldn't really bring food, and so the food and some of the basics of life had to be gotten from much closer. So yeah, it is. We fail to appreciate how the modern world, can so easily do it. And I should say, it's not easily done either. I mean, the U.S. military does an absolutely wonderful job logistically, to the extent that we just take it for granted that we can do what we need to do and do it pretty quickly. But that's so rare, and it couldn't have even been possible until the industrialization really hitting home in the second half of the 19th century. So
yeah, and and not only are they thousands of miles away, but they're in the desert. I mean, it'd be one thing, I guess, if you're 2,000 miles away and you're, I don't know, in some mountains where there's elk or berries or things like this, but you're reading stories about spiders and crocodiles or whatever. It's,
Yeah.
it's not like there's stuff to eat, and it's like a bunch of scrub brushes. Like,
Well, I mean, to be fair, the Delta was not necessarily exactly in that place where they were, but the Delta itself, of course, is a very valuable and very rich farming region. So that was not quite so much the issue. And of course, also, they had an endless supply of fresh water. They had the Nile. Now, of course, they got sick from it, but that's something that bedeviled armies and all the way up again until relatively recently. So it wasn't quite as dire as perhaps being short of water or being in a place where you couldn't get food. They could get food, but they got it mostly, as far as we can tell anyways, from the local area. But the local area was wealthy enough usually to be able to provide it. Now, there was one point in the Crusade where the Nile floods failed, and the Egyptians, of course, going back to their ancient period, they were well aware if the floods didn't come that there'd be a famine that year. And that did actually happen one of the years of the Damietta Crusade. So, that was a possibility, but that's a possibility everywhere. But still, relatively speaking, what they needed were horses, and they needed men, and they needed weapons. But as I say, the other stuff they maybe got from Cyprus, sometimes maybe from the Holy Land, or they got locally, rather than all the way back to Europe.
All right, so let's move a little bit into another area of expertise for you, and this will be a good tie-in for the show for anybody listening, because in the first episode I spoke with John D. Hosler and Daniel P. Frank, and they had just completed this book on military strategy, which had a bunch of chapters contributed by other authors, and you're one of those authors, and your chapter is on medieval military insurgency. So
Right.
this is a subject that when I heard this, even the very first time, I was very interested, because this seems like a subject that, I guess let's just say, is probably very unknown, untalked about. I think certainly for the common mind, maybe this is like a military historian thing that it's more commonly known, but I think for the average person who thinks about the medieval times, insurgency is not something that is common or known about at all. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about medieval military insurgency. How did you come to write that, and sort of what, maybe a little bit of what you found out?
Well, the simple answer as to insurgency is that John asked me to write it. So that's the simple answer. I admit that, it was not a deep expertise of mine. And so I really had to think hard about, so what am I going to say about insurgency? Now, one of the things that I've argued in a lot of my published work is that people tend to discount the Middle Ages or military part of the Middle Ages because, and of course John and Dan were talking about this very thing, that we can understand Greece and Rome because they kind of seem like us, especially Rome, but we don't understand the Middle Ages. And it's true, you have to kind of understand it all on its own terms. And so as I was racking my brain, what am I going to say about insurgency? I eventually came upon the idea, of just war, which of course is something that is a big deal for political scientists, diplomatic historians, and they always take just war back to Augustine, and then Augustine and Aquinas are the sort of, interestingly enough, this is where late antiquity and the Middle Ages actually have an impact because they're the ones that sort of came up with what's called just war theory. And so I looked at them and what they said about just war. And I was surprised that actually looking at the stuff, how little they actually said. So we've extrapolated an awful lot from very little about just war. And what struck me as I read them was that it seemed to me that they were actually, in a sense, describing possible insurgencies, because they both argued, Augustine first, obviously, argued that in order to have a just war, you have to have two states fighting. They didn't actually use those terms. the idea of a state is a much more modern concept, but that you had these two rulers or whatever that would fight, and if they do, then it's a just war. And then I thought, well, wait a second. So what if one of the sides is not a ruler, maybe not even a state? And I thought, my God, that's an insurgency, right? Because when we think about guerrilla wars or insurgencies now, it's usually a government fighting a group of rebels or something like that. So I thought, well, maybe in a sense they were talking about insurgencies. And of course, then Aquinas, he's a little more direct about what he says about just war, but he doesn't say a lot about it. And he, in many ways, he echoes Augustine, but it's the same thing. And some of what they wrote, you could, reading between the lines, think that, okay, what they're really talking about is insurgencies, but they just didn't have a word for it. And then as I thought further, I tried to think about in the long haul, because John wanted me to cover 1,000 years, instances where you did have non-state actors fighting a state, and how those have been interpreted differently. And I realized there was a couple instances where these really were insurgencies, even though we never really referred to them as insurgencies. So one of the examples I used was in Italy, after Belisarius landed in Italy, against the Ostrogoths, and I realized that, and I'd always said in my own classes that eventually the Eastern Roman army bogged down because there was a guerrilla war launched against them. And I kind of knew that, but I didn't know much about it. So I tried to dig through that, and I realized, yeah, indeed, they were fighting what amounted to an insurgency, and they were successful for quite a long time. I also thought about the Vikings. I mean, one of the other chapters in the John and Dan's book is on Viking strategy, and I haven't had the courage quite to look at it yet. Great scholar who did it, but I think, I wonder, what he might have to say versus what I said. But I kind of thought about it. It's like, in England, for example, the Vikings, they weren't a state, but they were trying to effect some kind of political change. So in some ways, you could see that as insurgency. But the real plum example of insurgencies happened in the 12th and 13th centuries, an era I'm very familiar with, and I'm not the first one to sort of maybe kind of make the connection. And that is that the English fighting in Wales, and then later on in Ireland, you had a couple of authors, perhaps most famously Gerald of Wales, who, if you read his accounts of how the Welsh fought, and then eventually how the Irish fought, I mean, it just screams insurgency. It's what it is. They just don't have a name for it. And what's more is that Gerald of Wales spelled out solutions. This is how you conduct a counterinsurgency. Now, did he use that language? No. But people didn't use that language, in 1880 either. So, and in those cases, John of Salisbury is the other. What's amazing is that these sources are really detailed, and they provide a kind of classic case of, these are insurgencies, and this is how you deal with the insurgencies. They just don't use that language. So I thought in the end, okay, well, other things that might be insurgencies were, what happens in a sort of classic case of a vassal defying their lord. And I thought, it could be, in fact, an insurgency. The Lord is supposed to do certain things, and if they don't, and the vassal decides to rebel, is that feudal anarchy? And I thought, no, that's silly. It could actually be construed as an insurgency. So some of what we might consider to be just, weird medieval violence really was more insurgent activity than chaotic violence. At least that's my argument. So those are the things I found, and of course, the chapter is relatively short. I'm sure there's a dissertation or a book out there waiting for somebody to do. It won't be me, but that's what I found in that short piece that I did.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about one of these examples, about what a medieval insurgency would have looked like. What exactly, because I think we kind of understand a little bit about what that looks like in modern times, but what would that have looked like 1,000 years ago?
Well, so in Wales, for example, there was not really unified government, and the English they were trying to control it, and the Welsh didn't want to be controlled, but they couldn't stand up to English armies most of the time. So they did the things that we would classically see as insurgencies. So, for example, they might ambush. Um, they wouldn't stand up in a battle. They would seek cover. Right, they would run away into the woods as soon as there was a sign of problem. So, I mean, these are the actions of a force that can't stand up to a conventional force. And so, eventually, with the advice given to people, this is how you win. There is, okay. First of all, you build castles right in the middle of stuff. Right, so you build these bastions, and so you can kind of control the territory around those areas. And when you capture somebody, you chop off their hand or you chop off their head, right? So you deal with them in a kind of terroristic sort of way to sort of cower the rest. But also, too, you bring people into your forces that know how to fight like that, right? Hire the locals or hire people that have expertise in that. Well, all that seems to me, classic counterinsurgencies. And so, and these are, at least a couple of writers who are writing these very things. I mean, not much different than what I'm saying to you. So, in Ireland, it was kind of the same way, same thing. They wouldn't stand up. They'd run away. You couldn't defeat them in a battle because they just wouldn't stand there for it. There were no fortifications to take. They melted away. So, but again, the same thing. You build castles in the middle of areas that don't want to comply. You treat the inhabitants harshly, or at least the ones that you suspect of operating against you. You bring in people who have experience with this kind of fighting, and you use them. So, I mean, it doesn't get more classically insurgent, I think, than it can get.
Yeah, and so I think the only two instances of this that come to mind for me as examples, I'm really not familiar with, for example, like the English versus the Welsh or even the Irish. But the two examples that potentially, I mean, you can clarify for me, that come to mind is Charlemagne's campaigns against the Saxons, where I guess the Saxons are sort of notoriously don't have a leader. So maybe they are able to stand up in these different battles, but it sort of keeps happening in there's these different rebellions or whatever. I guess you can tell me if you think that is kind of an insurgency, or the other one is the Black Douglas in Scotland.
I think that those could both be seen as insurgencies. So again, if you look at, and I start off with a definition in the chapter I wrote from the from military doctrine, U.S. military doctrine from 2018, on what the definition of an insurgency is. And if you use that definition, so the modern definition, you can see insurgencies in all different kinds of places. Now, I admit that I didn't look at Charlemagne's campaigns against the Saxons, but yeah, you could construe that as a possibility of an insurgency. I admit not to being as well versed on that aspect of it, and I wouldn't want to say, oh yeah, it's definitely an insurgency. But if you have a state actor against a non-state actor, you might have an insurgency. And the same in Scotland, perhaps. I mean, Scotland's an interesting case, though, because you did have a monarchy there, and it was recognized as a state. So, at least by standards of the day. So that maybe would be perhaps a little bit harder to label, but I have to admit that there may be others that may have more deeper experience with that than I do. So.
And to be fair, I only know, the only thing I know about Charlemagne and the Saxons is just about those couple sentences that I just repeated that I've heard. So I'm not claiming any deep knowledge that it was or anything like that. That just struck my mind hearing because I've just heard about how the Saxons were sort of notoriously decentralized, which made them very difficult to conquer, and that they were sort of causing trouble continually.
Right. And I think that was probably pretty common. And, I mean, there are some people that really work on this stuff, and, they may feel it's an insurgency, they might not. I mean, the things that I wrote, I mean, they are arguable. Certainly the Irish and the Welsh case to me seem pretty textbook, but beyond that. But as I say, if you go by the modern definition, and also if you go by what Augustine and Aquinas said, I do think that there were more examples of insurgency that we have typically labeled as just either rebellions or some kind of anarchy, or this is just proof that there was no that everything was chaos in the Middle Ages, which I don't think is the case. I mean, we're not as far away. I mean, I know that in that first episode with Dan and John, you guys talked about how the Middle Ages seem so strange and foreign to us. We think we understand Rome, and we don't, by the way, but we think we do. And so with the Middle Ages, it's strange and foreign, which is one of the reasons why we're so fascinated by it. But in the end, sometimes we think, well, there's just nothing to be learned from it. And I don't think that's true, but you just have to be sympathetic. You have to take them on their own terms. I mean, I tell my students this all the time. When you study abroad, you don't spend the time thinking, okay, this is not what we have. This is not what we have. Oh, this is not, you're trying to experience the culture. And I think that with the Middle Ages, military historians are reluctant to experience the culture. And so they just kind of dismiss it in the end. And that's too bad, because now, does it have lots of lessons for us today? I don't know. That's not why I study history. I think maybe I shouldn't say this, but I mean, John in particular, probably in his line of work at the Command and Staff College, maybe has to kind of tie it in. But I've never felt that. I mean, I see it as these are interesting things to know, and it's better to know stuff than not to know stuff. And you shouldn't dismiss a period just simply because you don't understand it.
I obviously run into a lot of people online, and I have a lot of discussions with people about history online. And I'm not a big fan of which is sort of, I think, the common, maybe because of that, there's that quote, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it.
Yeah, this is where I slap my head.
Yeah. And so I think there's a lot of people who think that history is just this series of lessons to be learned. And I think I'm not a big fan of that, but I think one of the things that's really interesting reading history from more primary sources, now that I've started to get more into the primary sources, is that I don't think that they necessarily thought of history as lessons to be learned. I think they wrote down for a variety of reasons. I'm not going to, try to say what all of those reasons are, but I don't think that they were writing history. That's my impression. Getting from it is like, here's a lesson. You got to think about this. We got to do this. I think a lot more of it was, record keeping, aspirational, these other types of things. And I think that this sort of lesson learning aspect of it is definitely a more modern phenomenon, maybe even directly just from that quote that is, everybody says it all the time. But I think that you're right, definitely, about the Middle Ages and how it is very different. That's one of the things that I find fascinating about it is that it is so different and unique rather than Rome or Greece. And I think I mentioned this in the first episode, that one of the reasons those things, probably one of the reasons for their popularity, is just that it's something that people sort of recognize. You recognize a bureaucracy, you recognize an administration, you sort of recognize this, I guess what I would call a bureaucratic army. We have all of these units, and everybody just plugs in, and you have the commander, and it's a unit over here and a commander. Whereas when you look at medieval armies, it's not exactly clear. There's all kinds of different nobility levels that are in the army. The army is not standardized. All the armies are different from all of each other. It takes a little bit of a deeper look to sort of really understand what's going on at any period or time. Whereas in Rome, you can say, okay, well, here, this guy had 3 legions. This guy had 5 legions, and you know what that means. But in the medieval period, if you say, oh, this guy raised an army of 20,000 men, you don't have any idea what that means. It could be 10,000 archers. It could be 1,000 knights. It could be 5,000 knights. It could be no knights. It could be the variance in what's going on is kind of crazy, because the period's very decentralized, and not straightforward as a standard bureaucratic apparatus. And so part of my thing is that I think one of the reasons it's popular is just because it's so common, or I shouldn't say common, more familiar with what we're used to.
Yeah, I teach a course on Rome, and I think again, as Dan and John said, you can't. Medieval people love Rome, and so and I like it too. I mean, it's a lot of fun to teach, but I spend the whole semester essentially emphasizing how different we are than Rome. Right? In other words, of saying no, forget that. Somehow all these things we have in common with them, because there's so many things we didn't have in common. About 2 hours from now, I'm going to lecture about the fact that history does not repeat itself. So you really have to kind of understand it on its own terms, and that would hold true even for Rome, but certainly for the Middle Ages. I was drawn to it too because it was just, I had learned very little about it. It just seemed fascinating. But I have learned over the decades that you just have to experience it, and I kind of liken it to foreign travel. I mean, you don't try to judge foreigners strictly by your own standards. You try to kind of understand them as a people, or as a culture, or as a nation. And that's how we should try to understand all cultures, but certainly the Middle Ages. And so I think that sometimes military historians have been remiss because they just don't want to take the time, or it's just easier to cut out 1,000 years. And, that's part of the Western, at least the Western military tradition, and shouldn't be cut out. We shouldn't skip from Greece and Rome and go directly to, the American Revolution or something like that, or the 30 Years' War or something. And that's been one of the things I think that military historians have very often failed to do, is to consider the Middle Ages.
In the Middle Ages, what is a period or time or place or something that you think is, aside from what we've talked about already, what do you think is worth study, worth taking a look at? What has sort of inspired you, or you found very interesting?
Well, I mean, the beauty of it is that even things that have been well trod, you can still find things to do on them, and so history is constantly rewritten. There's no such thing as real history. Every history is revisionist, and so with the passage of time, and my own recent book would be an example of this. I mean, Powell wrote a very good book on the Fifth Crusade almost 40 years ago. So why should anybody bother to write anything again? Well, because other sources, especially Arabic sources, have been translated that he didn't have access to. We think about let's say the Middle East now differently than we did in 1986. Right? I mean, after all, 9/11 has. There was a time before 9/11, and we thought about much of the Middle East differently than we do now. So I think that the Middle Ages overall is still understudied. So I think that people can't go wrong considering any of it. Now, what I will say is that as I did this project, and I've done other article-length pieces on the whole Middle Ages, and I realize how intimidating that is to me, because it's a long period of time, and it's really hard to generalize across 1,000 years. So, the specific period that I like to study and have published in is, more or less than a century. And that's because I can spend a whole lifetime, a whole career just on that. I mean, that's how much the Middle Ages has to offer. So I do think that the earlier Middle Ages is probably even, well, there's no question it's even more understudied than, let's say, the Central Middle Ages or the High Middle Ages and the Later Middle Ages. If you were to look at what medievalists do, probably a plurality do Later Middle Ages, and early Middle Ages is probably the least amount of people working on it. Doesn't mean that they couldn't, but they just don't. As I say, I was drawn to the Middle Ages for its very exoticness, and then I've learned to, I hope, be sympathetic to it, but it's taken a long time.
Yeah, I feel like it doesn't get enough credit for its exoticness. It's a great way to put it. And I'm saying that seriously, by the way.
Yeah, no. And I agree. Although on the other hand, too, I mean, once you learn stuff, then they become mundane, right? They're maybe not quite so exotic. I mean, the exotic is always what we really don't understand, or what we first encountered. And so, if you keep going back and looking, then you think, it's not exotic anymore, which doesn't make it any less interesting. It just means it's not as sort of foreign anymore.
So here's maybe an abstract general question for you. My sense of exploring medieval history is that certainly, I would say, let's say after the First Crusade, there's a lot more history available, or that's accessible, or that's been written about, or and not just in the Crusades, but let's say just in Western Europe. Whereas times prior to the First Crusade, there's a lot less that is written about or known. And so how much of that is due to lack of sources, or how much of that is due to the 100 Years' War is just really exciting, or these things relate to Britain, and then, we sort of have like an Anglo view of history? How much of, I guess, what the earlier period seems much less known and accessible and talked about and that sort of thing. I mean, if I think about it, if I take out essentially the Merovingians and the Carolingians, and then, I've sort of only recently been learning about Belisarius and Justinian. If I take out those two things, I'm sort of struggling to think about stuff that happened prior to the year 1000. Whereas after, we obviously have War of the Roses, 100-Year War, the Crusades, all these sorts of things. How much of that, I guess, is related to those things?
So it's still a sort of consensus, I think, among historians that there was a kind of explosion of writing after 1100, like, the Song of Roland, and not only in Latin, but also vernacular languages. So there is a kind of a sharp spike after, I would say, maybe closer to 1100. I mean, people may say it's a different decade or whatever, but I'd say somewhere around 1100. Sometimes it's called a golden age of, let's say, English historiography. I mean, there were a veritable ton of writers, English writers, writing history after 1100. And that's one of the reasons why we know a lot about Richard and the Plantagenets, the Angevins, because, I mean, there were just a lot of people writing. On the other hand, one of the things that, again, I constantly tell my students is that there are very few periods of this earth where you could really call them dark ages. So the reality is we know a lot about, there are lots of sources for stuff before the year 1000. It has to do really with what people's interests have been. I mean, historians' interests over the last 150 years, but more and more stuff prior to the year 1000 gets translated, and that's helpful, even for historians, but certainly for students. And so we know a lot more than meets the eye. So even though I would agree with you that the Carolingian Charlemagne, it seems like, that stuff is fairly readily available. There's a lot of stuff after that. We just don't talk about it, right? And there's a lot of stuff that's going on, not just militarily, but, monastically and socially and everything else. So there's probably quantifiably less before the year 1000, but I hesitate to say that because there's still a lot of stuff that has not just been made accessible. And so it's just waiting really for people to exploit. So in the later Middle Ages, you get a lot more stuff that's written in the vernacular. I mean, when you talk about Chaucer, you can almost read Middle English and get the gist of it. But people are interested in England. I mean, I sometimes tell students that for you guys, the only Middle Ages that ever existed were the ones in England. And there was a Middle Ages, at least for Europe. I wouldn't go so far as to say that for other places. I would say it was unfair to other places. But I mean, it was definitely a Middle Ages in France and German states and everywhere else too. So it's the earlier stuff simply has not been exploited to the same extent that things have been that come later.
I definitely get a sense that a certain amount of that is just about what is sort of commonly talked about.
Right.
And I get that certainly because, I have a lot of people that I talk with who are, I mean, I'm definitely not claiming to be an expert at all. I'm an enthusiast. So I'm just sort of getting into the history. And so a lot of this stuff I experience in sort of the same way as somebody who is also just getting into history now or just reading stuff now. And certainly that's sort of my experience with a lot of this stuff is that, oh, there's something else here. And then, oh, there's some other book that was written. Oh, there's something else that we know. Oh, this other thing that, is just never talked about or never known. And so I feel like a lot of that is really just the perception. And a lot of that even is based on entertainment. I feel like a lot of the Roman Empire's popularity in the last 20 years is just based on the movie Gladiator.
Yeah.
So
I would agree. It's these things do come and go. I mean, again, historiographically, the Middle Ages sort of took off in the 19th century. Suddenly, during the Romantic period, Ivanhoe and all that, I mean, Europe went gaga over the Middle Ages. So it was kind of rescued from the dustbin of history by people in the 19th century because as they were exploring their so-called national roots, they thought, gee, the national roots of Germany, I mean, however wrong they were then, were not actually in Rome. And, when you think about even our political institutions, I tell students this all the time. I mean, we have a Senate in the United States, but where does it actually derive from? Well, it's not the Roman Senate. It has virtually nothing in common with the Roman Senate except the name. It comes from English Parliament, I mean, the House of Lords. And so, that's the Middle Ages, definitely not Rome. Again, the Middle Ages are, worth a lifetime of exploration, but I would call myself an enthusiast as well. I mean, okay, so to some extent, maybe I've become an expert, but I'm not so hubristic to think that, I don't have a lot more to learn. I mean, that's the beauty of the scholarly life is that you get paid to learn stuff. And if that's what you like to do, well, then it's the perfect job. So.
Yeah, amazing. And we're coming up on time, so we'll wrap it up here. But what are you working on now? If there's anything that you want to talk about, anything that you have coming up or that you're putting together?
Well, I'm working on some smaller projects. I have to admit, unlike some of my colleagues who have 3 book ideas, I have one thing, and sometimes those things take a while. Damietta Crusade took the better part of a decade for me to do. I mean, things get in the way, and I was publishing other stuff too. But I mean, so I don't have I have a kind of a book project I've been thinking about, and that's just to do a long view history of Western military history. I've taught a course here at the college where I teach on Western history of the of military in the Western world. And I've thought about doing that because, military historians who write long view histories on the military history, essentially, of the Western world, they almost always do it from, they're 19th century historians, and they're going to write about Greece and Rome, which they recognize, and then, shaft the Middle Ages. So there's been a lot fewer works on Western military history, long view, from somebody who's actually a Roman historian or a medieval historian. I mean, there's a few Roman historians who have done that, but fewer medievalists. I mean, John France is one that comes to mind, and I've thought about doing that. Right now, I mean, I've been working on an article about an incident during the Albigensian Crusade that kind of gets swept under the rug, and I've tried to bring attention to the fact that this atrocity that happened there was probably worse in many ways than what happened at Béziers, which is the most infamous incident of the Albigensian Crusade, where thousands of people were slaughtered. But this took place about a decade later. You can kind of pinpoint, or at least I believe I can pinpoint the responsibility for who is responsible for it. Whereas for Béziers, yeah, okay, people blamed people, but it was kind of spontaneous. So some article length pieces, really, rather than the big project of, although I want to work towards that military history.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I guess I'll leave you. We can end it there, or if you have any final words that you'd like to say about anything we talked about today, or medieval history, anything like that, I'll let you have the last word, or we can end it there, whatever you'd like.
Well, I guess I would just say that the Middle Ages are endlessly fascinating, and they can be interpreted in a manifold a number of ways, that there's always room for more, and they are inclusive, and that people should give them a chance and do some reading or researching, and you see how fascinating they are.